In the summer of 1959, on a stretch of open tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, an aircraft sat exposed to the weather. Rain, sun, snow, wind carrying dust and moisture across an unprotected aluminum skin. It had been sitting like this, on and off, for most of a decade. This was not a forgotten cargo plane or a surplus trainer nobody wanted. This was the aircraft that had ended the deadliest war in human history, the B-29 Superfortress that had carried the first atomic weapon ever used in combat, on a mission that remains 80 decades later, one of the most consequential and most argued about events of the 20th century. And in 1959, it was rotting outdoors because nobody, not the Air Force, not the Smithsonian Institution that legally owned it, had anywhere indoors big enough or funded enough to put it. This is the story of how the most historically significant aircraft of the American 20th century nearly destroyed itself simply by being left outside, and how saving it required something that sounds almost contradictory. The Smithsonian solution to stop the bomber from falling apart was to take it apart completely, on purpose, piece by piece, and not put it back together again for over 20 years. To understand how this happened, you need to understand what this particular aircraft was, and what institutions actually do with objects too significant to destroy and too complicated to immediately display. The B-29 in question carried the designation 4486292. It had been built by the Glenn L. Martin Company at a bomber plant in Nebraska, one of 15 B-29s constructed to a specialized wartime configuration that stripped out gun turrets and armor to maximize range and altitude for a single specific kind of mission. On August 6, 1945, under the command of Colonel Paul Tibbets, this aircraft dropped a uranium-based atomic weapon on the city of Hiroshima, Japan. The aircraft's name, painted on the nose just before the mission, was Enola Gay, after the pilot's mother. The mission ended the most destructive conflict in human history within days. It also opened a new and permanent argument about the morality, necessity, and consequences of nuclear warfare that has not stopped in the 8 decades since. After the war, the aircraft flew a small number of additional missions, including participation in post-war nuclear weapons testing at Kwajalein Atoll in 1946. Then, recognizing its significance, military and government officials made the decision to preserve rather than scrap it. On August 30, 1946, ownership of the aircraft was formally transferred to the Smithsonian Institution. This is the part of the story that surprises most people. Being formally owned by the Smithsonian did not mean the aircraft had anywhere to go. Between 1946 and 1961, the Enola Gay existed in a kind of institutional limbo that is almost unimaginable for an artifact of this significance by today's museum standards. The aircraft moved between multiple storage locations across more than a decade: Arizona, Illinois, Texas, and eventually Maryland, without ever finding a permanent, weather-protected home. At several of these locations, including extended stretches at Andrews Air Force Base, the bombers sat outdoors, fully exposed to the elements, because the Smithsonian simply did not have a facility large enough or funded enough to house an aircraft with a wingspan of over 140 feet. The consequences of this exposure were not subtle. Aluminum aircraft skin left outdoors for years develops corrosion, especially around seams, rivets, and areas where moisture can collect and remain trapped. Rubber seals and gaskets dry out and crack under repeated cycles of heat and cold. Glass and plexiglass canopies become clouded and brittle under prolonged ultraviolet exposure. Paint fails, exposing bare metal to direct weathering. None of this happens instantly. It happens slowly, across years, in exactly the kind of gradual, cumulative way that makes it easy for an institution to underestimate the urgency of the problem until the damage becomes severe. It got worse than weather alone. Left unguarded and exposed for extended periods, the aircraft became a target for what museum professionals describe in carefully neutral language as unauthorized removal of components. In less careful language, people climbed onto an unguarded historic aircraft and took pieces of it home as souvenirs. Instruments, small fittings, anything that could be removed by hand and carried away. And then, nature took its own interest. Birds began nesting inside the aircraft's open compartments. Insects established themselves in spaces that were never designed to host them. An aircraft built to extraordinarily precise aerodynamic and structural tolerances was, by the late 1950s, functioning as an accidental wildlife shelter on a military runway. By 1959, the man most responsible for the Smithsonian's aircraft collection, Paul Garber, the institution's founding curator of aeronautics, had become seriously concerned that the Enola Gay would not survive in any historically meaningful condition if it remained outdoors much longer. What happened next is the part of this story that sounds, on the surface, like exactly the wrong solution to a preservation crisis. In August 1960, Smithsonian collection staff arrived at Andrews Air Force Base with a plan that involved not preserving the Enola Gay in its current assembled state, but systematically disassembling it into its major structural components. This was not a decision made lightly, and it was not a small undertaking. Over the course of roughly 11 months, beginning in August 1960, the forward and aft fuselage sections were separated from each other and removed individually. The four massive engines were unmounted from the wing structure. The wings themselves, each one a complex multi-section assembly, were detached from the fuselage and then further broken down into outboard and inboard sections for transport. The tail assembly was removed. The propellers were detached from their engines. Every major component that could be separated was separated. The logic behind this approach, once you understand the alternative, becomes clear. An aircraft of this size, in this condition, could not simply be picked up and moved indoors as a single unit. There was no facility with doors large enough and no transport method capable of relocating an assembled aircraft with a 141-foot wingspan without risking further damage to an already deteriorating structure. The only practical way to get the Enola Gay out of the weather and into protected storage was to break it down into pieces small enough to transport individually. By July 1961, the last components of the disassembled bomber left Andrews Air Force Base, bound for the Smithsonian Storage Facility in Suitland, Maryland, known as the Paul E. Garber Preservation, Restoration, and Storage Facility, named for the same curator who had pushed for the aircraft's rescue from outdoor deterioration. The Enola Gay was, for the first time since the war, finally indoors and out of direct weather exposure. It was also, now, not an aircraft. It was a collection of large, disconnected, aging components, wings here, fuselage sections there, engines somewhere else, sitting in storage, disassembled with no announced plan or timeline for ever being reassembled into anything resembling the bomber that had flown over Hiroshima 15 years earlier. What followed the 1961 move was not a restoration. It was a much longer and much less certain period, more than 2 decades during which the disassembled Enola Gay simply existed in storage, its components preserved from active weather damage but otherwise essentially untouched. This was not unique to the Enola Gay. Large aircraft preservation in the mid-20th century operated under resource constraints that are difficult to appreciate from today's perspective, when major museums routinely raise tens of millions of dollars for single restoration projects. The Smithsonian's aeronautics collection in this period contained vastly more historically significant material than it had funding, staff, or facility space to actively conserve. difficult triage decisions were made constantly, and an aircraft sitting safely indoors, even disassembled, even untouched, registered as a problem already solved compared to artifacts still facing active outdoor deterioration. But safely stored is not the same as actively preserved, and by the early 1980s, advocates both inside and outside the Smithsonian had begun pushing for the Enola Gay situation to change. Two veterans of the 509th Composite Group, the unit that had flown the atomic missions, became particularly vocal. Former pilot Don Rail and former navigator Frank Stewart felt that an aircraft of this historical magnitude deserved better than indefinite disassembled storage, and they began lobbying figures with the institutional weight to make something happen. Retired General Paul Tibbets himself, who had commanded the mission, and Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, a longtime advocate for the National Air and Space Museum's development. The campaign succeeded, at least in securing institutional commitment. By 1983, with new museum leadership in place, the Smithsonian formally committed to restoring the Enola Gay to display condition. The restoration began on December 5, 1984, 23 years after the aircraft had first arrived at Garber in pieces, and 37 years after the Smithsonian had first taken ownership of it. The restoration that began in December 1984 was, by the Smithsonian's own internal assessment, the largest and most complex aircraft restoration project the institution had ever attempted. The initial estimate from the specialists assigned to the project was that full restoration would require 7 to 9 years of dedicated work. It took nearly 20. The gap between that estimate and the eventual timeline tells you something important about what this kind of restoration actually involves once work begins in earnest. Every component that had been sitting in storage since 1961 needed individual assessment. Corrosion damage from the years of outdoor exposure before disassembly, additional deterioration that had occurred even in protected storage, missing parts that had either been lost during the original disassembly process or removed by souvenir hunters decades earlier during the aircraft's most vulnerable outdoor period. Where original components could be cleaned, stabilized, and reused, restoration staff did exactly that. And to this day, the Enola Gay is considered approximately 99% original material, an extraordinarily high figure for an aircraft restoration of this scale and complexity. Where original parts were too degraded to safely reuse or simply could not be located, replacements were either sourced from other airframes or fabricated by hand to match original specifications, and carefully marked internally so that future curators and researchers would always be able to distinguish original 1944 manufacturing from later restoration work. Two of the aircraft's 4 massive engines were rebuilt at the Garber facility itself. The other 2 were sent to a different specialized facility, the San Diego Air and Space Museum, for their own rebuild process, a reflection of just how specialized and resource-intensive rebuilding a 1940s aircraft engine to functional, displayable standard actually is, even decades after the type stopped being manufactured. The restoration ultimately consumed approximately 300,000 work hours. A significant portion of that time came from volunteers, people who donated their professional skills and personal time specifically because they understood what this particular aircraft represented, regardless where they personally stood on the unresolved moral arguments surrounding its mission. The Enola Gay was not fully displayed as a complete assembled aircraft until 2003, 58 years after its mission over Hiroshima, and 42 years after it had been broken down into pieces at Andrews Air Force Base. In between, in 1995, a partial display of just the forward fuselage section sparked one of the most significant controversies in the Smithsonian's history, a public argument over how and whether the aircraft's role in ending one war while beginning the nuclear age should be presented to the public. That argument is its own story, and it is not the story this video is telling. What matters here is simpler, and in some ways more universal to anyone who cares about preserving historical objects. An aircraft this significant nearly lost its physical integrity simply by sitting outside for too long, in a gap between wartime urgency and peacetime resources that almost every major historical artifact eventually falls into. The solution that saved it required institutions and individuals to accept something deeply counterintuitive: that the fastest way to stop an irreplaceable object from falling apart on its own terms was to take it apart deliberately on someone else's terms, and trust that the patience to eventually put it back together would still exist 20 years later. That patience held, barely, and only because specific people, a concerned curator in 1959, two veterans in 1980, a new museum director in 1983, refused to let an aircraft this significant remain a problem deferred indefinitely. Today, the Enola Gay stands fully assembled at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia, viewed by millions of visitors a year. Most of them have no idea that for longer than the aircraft's active combat service, longer than the war itself, it existed not as a bomber and not yet as a museum piece, but as a disassembled set of components in storage, waiting for an institution to find the time, the money, and the will to put it back together. The bomb run over Hiroshima took less than a minute. Putting the aircraft that carried it back together took 20 years.